Hi, this is Guy Burgess. For this post, I'd like to explore a topic that we used to think was unthinkable. That is, what is the risk of large-scale civil unrest and violence in the United States? Or put another way, just how bad could the red-blue confrontation get? Are we looking at a second U.S. Civil War? God forbid. Or are we looking at large-scale civil unrest of the kind that characterized the country in the 60s and early 70s? It's certainly true that the United States has something of a violent history, though I think most countries have a violent history if you look far enough. Just a couple of examples. The new Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. This is the Lynching Museum that recently was open. There are stories all throughout Wikipedia and on the roadsides of America of things like the Wounded Knee Massacre of Native Americans or the Ludlow Massacre that surrounded a coal mining strike in Colorado. It's also true that the United States has pretty high levels of underlying criminal violence. If you look at our incarceration rates, we are just off the charts compared to every other country on the planet. Now, part of that is we have a prison industrial complex, and we have politicians that are competing to be tougher on crime than anybody else. But there's also a sense in which maybe we do have more crime than we'd like to think. Our homicide ranking is 126th out of 219 countries. Gun violence is a lot higher. We're at the 67 out of 76, that is in terms of the amount of gun violence. We also don't do very well on the Global Peace Index. There are lots of countries, Canada, Western Europe, that do much, much better than we are. In fact, we're sort of in the same category as China and a lot of the Middle East and Africa and South America. We'd like to think we do better than that. If you look at these charts from the Pew People in the Press organization that measure increasing hostility between the left and the right in the United States, you see over time that we're getting more and more polarized. So the question is, how bad could it get? And it's, I think, useful to look back 50 years to 1968 and the years around 1968, in part as a reminder that things could be worse, in part as a warning on how bad things could get, and maybe a caution that things could get even worse. The mid-60s was a time for large-scale civil unrest in a great many cities in the United States. We saw the Kerner Commission report that tried to look into the causes of this, something that was commissioned by President Johnson. And in the backdrop of that kind of underlying racial tension, you had in 1968 the assassination of Martin Luther King. And literally overnight, a large fraction of the big cities and the not so big cities in the United States erupted into violence. To give you a sense of what happened, the Washington Post recently ran this excellent article. And it was actually a multimedia presentation that looked at the 4 days following King's assassination and what happened in D.C. And multiply that by city after city after city, and you get a sense of the social upheaval that's not all that far below the surface. One of the most stunning charts to come out of the Washington Post article was this map, and this is an animation in real time, well, an animation on their website, and each one of these are incidents that occurred. So it wasn't like it was a concentrated one place there was a riot where all the cameras, it was the whole city erupted. In fact, the whole country erupted. And this was only one of a series of stresses on the society in the late 60s. There was the Vietnam War. Kids were being drafted to fight in a war that really nobody had convinced them that it was really necessary. And Now, I was certainly part of the Vietnam generation. In fact, I came into the peace and conflict field in part to study what was going on then that was tearing apart our lives. And then on top of that, just a few months after the Martin Luther King assassination, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Just after he'd won the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. He was, in a very real sense, the Barack Obama of his time. And to lose somebody like that, and there wasn't anybody to replace him really, was equally jarring to another very large segment of the society. This played out in the 1968 Democratic National Convention, where there were widespread riots in the streets. There were huge conflicts over who, in fact, was entitled to be a delegate at the convention. That further contributed to the underlying tensions in the society. And then a couple of years later, you had a whole series of demonstrations, some bordering on violence about the war in Vietnam. And then there was Kent State, where the National Guard, for reasons that are still a bit murky, fired into a crowd of student demonstrators, killed 4 of them. And again, the very next day, cities all over the country erupted in gigantic marches. I was part of one in Colorado that probably had 100,000 people in the state capitol. And this was also a time when the culture wars were arguably more intense than they are today, if you can quite imagine that. The whole notion of the making of a counterculture, the make love not war generation, the stresses that placed on traditional values. We really saw a proliferation of bumper stickers just like this, and people were deadly serious about it. America, love it or leave it. And this was middle America, mainstream American conservatives, America's reaction to the protesters. And everywhere there was this kind of tension. But somehow we stepped back from the brink. And this didn't go into large-scale civil unrest and violence. It could have easily been much, much worse. Part of this was Watergate. And the system held. And Nixon was ultimately forced from office. But the tensions remain. This is an interesting retrospective on the Kerner Commission report written by the one last member of the commission who's still around, talking about how we really haven't dealt with the problem of racism yet. So, will we step back from the brink of large-scale unrest this time? I don't know. Distrust for the system is very deep and very widespread. You see it on Black Lives Matter. Go to their website. You get a sense of how much distrust there is of the system. Or go to the National Rifle Association and you're greeted with this. This is a time for warriors. And the warriors aren't fighting some foreign enemy. They're fighting within the United States. We could very easily have a process of stepwise escalation, that is provocation and counter-provocation. Already taboo lines are collapsing and things that we used to think were unthinkable conflict strategies are now accepted. It doesn't take too much to go beyond that. You have all sorts of inflammatory media. This article, the Democrats would lose a second Civil War too. Now you get this esprit de corps sense that you can't possibly, your side can't lose. We're also looking at deliberate provocations. I think one of the real things that Special Counsel Mueller has been able to determine is that there was a deliberate effort on the part of Russia to try to drive the escalation spiral in the United States and really pit the country against one another. And that's a different kind of conflict problem, but a serious one. We also have to deal with the problem of violent extremism. These are just a few examples of organizations trying to deal with violent extremism in other parts of the world. It could happen here. There are plenty of people who know how to engage in a wide range of violent extremist tactics. And there are real security threats too. Our society is astonishingly vulnerable. If the taboos against attacking the society as a whole ever break, we could easily be in a lot of trouble. What might trigger something like this? Well, politically motivated mass shootings and terrorism. Just imagine what would happen if we'd have a sequence of Las Vegas type shootings that were deliberate attacks on the left and the right. That could easily escalate into the kind of thing that would produce something like this map from 1968 with lots and lots of incidents. It's not something that would be concentrated, but it'd be deep grassroots violence and confrontation. And there are questions about what would happen if Trump were vindicated or victorious or removed from office or defeated. Ask yourself what the most hot-headed people on your side or the other side are going to do when one or the other of these two options comes to pass, which is pretty likely. And there's a sense in which, this big anti-Trump movement has been singularly unsuccessful in persuading the other side that they should pull back in their support for Trump. We have all this intensity and conflict, but we're not changing anybody's minds. All of this could result in two scenarios. If it turns out that the power of one side over the other turns out to be a lot different, you could really wind up with an authoritarian society in which the more powerful faction oppresses the other using high-tech techniques, sort of similar to 1984, but with the latest things that come out of Silicon Valley, which is a pretty scary possibility. The other scenario is an equal power conflict, and here you get what Quincy Wright saw as the key definition of war. A confrontation where the relative power is so nearly equal as to lead to the extreme intensification of each. That's a funny little acronym there that I learned from Howard Higman in my study of war class, where we read Quincy Wright as an undergraduate, and it's stuck with me ever since. It's this notion that if you have confrontations by large groups of equal power, they'll be compelled to go all out and use every confrontation strategy available to them, regardless of the taboo lines that will have to fall. This is what produces the terrible atrocities in society. So these are not very attractive options. So will we find a way to step back from the brink? Truth is, I don't know. But I'll leave you with something I learned from Kenneth Boulding. He used to like to cite Murphy's Law as an unequivocal scientific fact by adding the word eventually. If anything can go wrong, it eventually will. If we allow today's tensions to persist, sooner or later they'll lead to catastrophe. So somehow we've got to find a way to step back from the brink.